All right, Dr. Sadloff discussed some aspects of the morphology or makeup of the vocal folds, which is extremely important relative to vibratory action. So we have the epithelium, and then deep to that is the lamina propria with the superficial layer, intermediate layer, and deep layer. The contents of this tissue changes a little bit more collagen fiber toward the deeper end, and then it's followed by the vocalis muscle. And this is a very pliable system, unless it has some disease or lesion. What's really of importance, as Dr. Sadloff pointed out, is that the intermediate and deep layers here in blue compose the vocal ligament. And one of the primary aspects of the vocal ligament are when you do have lesions. And so you don't want to nick that because that could lead to stiffer vocal folds. But the lamina propria is a very pliable system, and we'll see how that works in just a few minutes, or before. If you look down at the vocal folds, this white line here to this white line down here, this is the membranous vocal folds, and then the glottis is called the membranous glottis, the anterior glottis. This is the vocal process tip right here and right there. So this is the posterior glottis or the cartilaginous glottis. If you look at the vocal folds through this line here in a vertical cut, you get what you see over here with the vocal fold on the right and the left outline. This is a frontal view. So one of the questions that we sometimes have is, well, you know, like the basic question we have is, how do you relate fundamental frequency with the period or this, how long a cycle of phonation lasts? So if you take this sequence here as a series of one cycle and starts at time 0, and that amount of time is, say, 0.01 seconds or 10 milliseconds, if you take that amount of time and take 1 divided by that amount of time, you have 100 hertz. So the relationship of the period for one cycle and the fundamental frequency is just the inversion of those numbers.
Under normal light, because the vocal folds are vibrating, the edges appear blurred. Under a stroboscopic light, the vibrations can be seen in slow motion.
So if you now take the frontal view of that, you get actually the video that was constructed from Hirano's 10 phases here. And the main thing to realize for sure is the immense necessity for very pliable mucosal tissue here. So this yellow portion here is going to be deforming throughout the cycle, and it's going to go from a converging to a diverging shape as well. Converging, diverging. When the glottis is open, that is when the vocal folds are separated, well here, the vocal folds are touching, so the air does not come through the glottis, but when the vocal folds are separated, now air does come through the glottis. And thus you get these cyclic glottal volume flows, those waveforms, which is really kind of cool. Now, one of the main aspects of fundamental frequency is actually the vocal fold length, as Dr. Sadloff mentioned. So let's talk about the length and contour a little bit. One always must think in terms of antagonistic muscle groups from a clinical point of view, from a research point of view, from a vocal training point of view. The antagonistic muscles for vocal fold length are the cricothyroid muscle that was discussed, pulls the cricoid up toward the thyroid cartilage. And also then antagonistic to that is the vocalis muscle with fibers that are anterior-posterior. So when the vocalis muscle contracts itself, it shortens the vocal fold as well. And so these two are in antagonistic action, Vocal fold length, though, is primarily from CT, but you have to consider the vocalis as well. So when the cricothyroid muscle in this little green line here is relaxed, the distance between the front of the cricoid and the thyroid here is the greatest, and the vocal folds are shortest. And then when you contract the cricothyroid, it shortens itself, pulls the cricoid up toward the thyroid, rotates this arytenoid cartilage back, and elongates the vocal fold. So here's an example of that elongation with pitch rise, or pitch rise with elongation. So you have this cricothyroid muscle here, and then we can take a look at it. You can see that as the vocal folds elongate, the fundamental frequency goes up because basically the tension in this tissue and the mass. That's interesting. Because as it elongates, the tension increases, but also the mass in motion is a little bit less. Both of those things allow the fundamental frequency to go up. That range there was about 32 semitones, a couple octaves, and an augmented fifth. So congratulations to that learning. When the vocal folds are longest and stretched, then the contour of the vocal folds is something like this, where this distance here, or if you wish, the length of the vertical portion of the glottis is only like 1 millimeter or so in falsetto. And then for low pitches, when the vocal folds are shorter, they're a little bit more bunched. The vertical length of the glottis is longer. And also it'd be a little bit longer too when the vocalis itself contracts and bulges out that lower portion. So the basic string equation for string, ribbon, etc. is actually quite important in understanding basics of fundamental frequency. The fundamental frequency in the string equation analogy is 1 over 2L. L is the length of the vocal fold tissue that is in vibration. That's got to be the tissue in vibration. By the way, tissue that's not in vibration isn't part of a phonatoid situation relative to pitch. So 1 over L, that's the length of the fold in vibration, times the square root of T. This T is the tension of the tissue in vibration, and divided by rho, which is the density of the tissue. And so in soft phonation, when the mucosa is just in motion, the tension of that mucosa is what this T is, and whatever the L is. But then when you have louder phonation, you involve also the vocalis muscle in the motion. And so it's now a combination of the tension of the mucosa and the vocalis that contributes to this T. From a clinical point of view, where especially relative to edema, you can change this equation into this little expression here, 1/2 times the square root of force here is really external force that's stretching the vocal folds. Think of it in terms of the cricothyroid muscle pulling. And then down here, the length of the tissue in motion, and here's the mass of the tissue in motion. And notice that if you have edema, this mass will increase. But because it's down here, that means that the fundamental frequency will decrease as mass increases. And so from a clinical point of view, this expression actually can be quite relevant. So let's turn to basic registers. There's still, by the way, 3 basic registers for the voice. I like that. So vocal fry, chest, falsetto, and there are other names for those, as you know. And then we also have more complicated ones that everybody in this room has to know about, head register, mixed registers. So let's look at what fry and chest and falsetto look like. And trying to stroke fry is a tough thing to do, by the way. So here's vocal fry. Notice the high adduction, which means that if you want to exercise the adductory muscles, for example, the interretinoid muscles in the back, just, practice vocal fry. There's a lot of adduction there. Chest register, higher pitch, normal pitches. Notice this beautiful mucosal wave in this particular video, stroboscopy. This is what we want to see in the mucosal wave, and it's full closure for a while, etc. I mean, isn't that cute? And then falsetto, notice that the motion is still a mucosal wave, but it's only by about 1 millimeter in height there. But it's still same motion. Falsetto is still in the same region relative to mucosal wave. Yeah, put that on your wall. Okay. Another basic aspect is adduction. Let's talk about that. We have 2 arytenoid cartilages. They sit on top of the cricoid cartilage, like Dr. Satelov was talking about. Right here and right there are the 2 vocal processes, and they are the most important aspects relative to adduction. They have to line up when you're trying to adduct for phonation. So there is a facet between the arytenoids and the cricoid below. We have a short axis here in yellow. You can see that. Hello. There is a short axis, and that's the rocking action of the arytenoid. And then there's also a long axis, and that's the gliding. And so in adduction from abduction, this arytenoid is going to rock in, but also glide up for adduction. And so let's talk about this rocking action. So here we have a cylinder and something on top like that. And it's going to be just like our facet for cricoid and arytenoid. And Dave Broad, a long time ago, kind of measured a 30 degree, is that 30 degrees? Yeah. Motion for this rocking aspect. But also we have the gliding aspect that can glide up and down this long axis. So what's really interesting, if you look down at the larynx and you have the person breathing, and then you say, go ahead and phonate, and the arytenoids seem to be coming straight across. And that's a combination of this rocking down and in, and gliding up and back. And so you go from this abducted position to this adducted position. It looks like the arytenoids, the vocal processes basically come straight across, and voila, they actually kind of do. So that's kind of cool. We also have, in a basic sense for phonation, something that's called the phonatory adductory range. The adductory range in which phonation is possible. Here's where we get breathy and normal and pressed that Dr. Sundberg was talking about. This picture here is wide open, fully open, least resistance to the airflow. And then, as you adduct the arytenoids so that the vocal folds get closer, and notice that you adduct the arytenoids to move the vocal fold. Vocal folds only go where the arytenoids tell them. It's really important. Paradoxical vocal fold motion, that's paradoxical arytenoid motion. There is a adductory level where breathy boundary is there, and that's the beginning of phonation. So the distance here, in this particular person actually, this distance between the vocal processes is 14% of this distance. So you have to go a long ways until you get phonation. And then there's a normal breathy boundary, a little bit more adduction. Then there's more adduction, pressed normal boundary. And then if you hyperadduct, you can get aphonic where you can't phonate at all. So there is this phonatory adductory range within which the vocal folds have to be in order to be able to phonate. So let's take a look at breathing normal breath.
Voice qualities will now be demonstrated.
Hope you can see that.
If I talk in a very breathy manner, such as this, you can notice that the space between the two vocal folds is slightly open toward the top of the slit. When this happens, air escapes and you get the breathy sound. If I press the larynx too firmly together like this, then the structures are pressed together and you get that pressed sound. And if I talk normally, they are not so pressed together.
Now let's talk about air pressures. We have subglottal pressure, we have transglottal pressure, we have intraglottal pressures, and then also movement and glottal airflow as a result. So Dr. Sundberg talked about subglottal pressure. I'd like to also indicate how that's created. Typically what you do is you inhale some air and then you set or are about to set the level of glottal adduction depending on the quality of the vocal sound you want. And then you apply the recoil from the relaxation pressure as well as muscle forces from the torso to what? To reduce the volume of the lung. Those recoil and muscle forces are to reduce the volume of the lung for egressive airflow. So you combine reduction of lung volume and glottal adduction in order to create subglottal pressure. So if the vocal folds are close enough and pliable enough, and the forces to reduce lung volume are high enough, then this creates enough subglottal air pressure to force the vocal folds to move into oscillation. That is what we call vibration as well. So subglottal pressure will be greater if the vocal folds are actually closer, or if there is greater force to reduce the lung volume to make it reduce faster. So one aspect that is clinically and important in many other ways is phonatory threshold pressure, PTP. It's the lowest subglottal pressure or transglottal pressure that causes and maintains phonation. It's about 3 centimeters for centimeters of water. That's what's funny. 3 centimeters of what? I'm sorry, it's an internal joke. 3 centimeters of water for lower notes, and then it increases as pitch increases, because as the vocal folds elongate, as Dr. Sundberg mentioned, the tension increases, so it takes more force to move them. So PTP rises with elongation of the vocal folds. Now, if you look at all the literature, there's a wide range of how the pressure changes across people. But people like me think like, well, maybe the methods are no good that they use. But anyway, PTP is higher usually for vocal fold lesions as well. So it's an objective measure before and after intervention that's quite valuable in the clinic. So what's transglottal pressure? Transglottal pressure is the difference between two pressures. The average value subglottally minus the average value supraglottally is the definition of transglottal pressure that we use in the usual word. So notice too that this subglottal pressure minus supraglottal pressure is a pressure that actually forces upward on the vocal folds. And this is part of the reason why, if you look up here, the vocal folds will actually rise and then fall, rise and fall. They don't just go back and forth. So you have to have a vertical push, and that's a lot to do with this transglottal pressure. What are interglottal pressures? These are pressures that are inside the glottis that push and pull on the vocal folds to allow them to vibrate. Now, you can't have interglottal pressures without transglottal pressures, but there is a difference actually in their function. Here's a glottal volume flow, and we think that the sound is in the glottal flow itself. This is one cycle, and repeat that cycle. Each cycle will have a sound to it, and the ear picks up what that quality of the sound is, and the loudness, etc., relative to
there may be some flow
source.
through the
So the source of sound is the air flow,
cartilaginous or posterior glottis.
the changes in
that
air
can be
flow.
separately.
So how does this come about?
So
Well, here we have the
happens
vocal
is
folds that
when
are
the
touching.
folds,
There's no flow coming
that
through
separate
the membranous
airflow starts
glottis,
to come out.
but there may be
Notice
some
that the
flow
shape is
through the
convergent. Looks like this.
cartilaginous or posterior
This,
glottis.
the
Because
convergent
they
vocal folds, as they are separated,
So what happens is when the vocal folds
for
that
egress
separate,
because
airflow starts to come out, but notice that this shape is convergent, and it looks
So
like
this is
this.
positive pressure
And
that literally
this,
pushes the vocal
the
folds.
convergent vocal folds, as they are separated, are being
And then
pushed out by this
glottis
positive
reaches its
pressure
maximum
for egress
area
here,
as you're
because
looking
the
down
pressure
on
down here in the trachea is
But notice that's
that communicates
before
into here.
it reaches.
So this is positive pressure that literally
highest
pushes the vocal
airflow
folds
moving through the glottis.
separating
That
from
doesn't
each other.
happen until the
And
folds
then
turn around
the
and
glottis
back.
reaches
Now
its
it's maximum
maximum
So,
area as
this
you're looking
flow
down
peak
on the glottis.
comes after
But notice that's
the glottal
before
peak.
it
And we
reaches
sometimes refer to that
the
as
highest airflow coming through the glottis, and that doesn't happen until the folds turn around a little bit, and now you have the
Yes, thank you,
highest flow.
skewing.
So
Skewing to
this
the right.
flow peak
Yes.
comes after the glottal area peak, and we sometimes refer to that as
Now, what happens here? So we have the maximum flow here with a divergent glottis.
shifting to the right.
And what accounts for the skewing? The basic
Yes,
reason
thank you,
is
skewing. Skewing to the right.
As the air
Yes.
comes through the glottis, it meets the air of the vocal tract, it has to push on that air.
Now, what happens here? So we have the maximum flow here with a divergent glottis, and what accounts for the skewing? The basic reason is the divergence of the air of the vocal tract. As the air comes through the glottis, it meets the air of the vocal tract and has to push on that air, and that is a delay tactic relative to the maximum air resistance. You can also have two minor aspects, divergence of the same shape, because it's divergent and that flow is maximum.
So there's a little bit
The resistance to the flow is less, or this is divergent angle is resistance. Hello, Dan.
come in this. That's on that right
If you have the same angle, so it's less resistant, more resistant, and so there's a little bit more, less resistance on the right side. And also movement, this is cool. So as the vocal folds
So
go
that's
out,
where you have negative pressure
when they
in the
come in,
glottis.
it kind of squishes it. That's the divergent right side as well. So a little bit comes
And the
from
whole Bernoulli effect is actually so negative pressure
primarily
two folds toward each other.
and so that's when you have negative pressure.
Now,
in the
what is
glottis.
this negative pressure in the glottis? Bernoulli equation gives you the fact that we have the Bernoulli.
And lo and behold,
The Bernoulli
effect is actually there.
negative pressure.
However, well, so negative pressure
that's
pulls the
the
two
Bernoulli
folds
effect.
toward
And it
each other.
occurs here
It's,
during the
and,
divergent.
Now, what is this negative pressure in the glottis?
That's
Bernoulli
most of
equation
the
gives you
negative
the
pressure
fact
is
that we have a
rarefaction
fraction.
above.
The Bernoulli effect,
As
as definition,
as
is
being cut
negative
off,
pressure.
molecules separate above.
So
you
that's
have
the
pressure
Bernoulli
there.
effect, and it occurs
It's
here
in the
during
glottis.
the
Maybe this is more
divergent
negative.
shape. But actually, most of the negative pressure is due to rarefaction above.
Really
as the air
important
comes through, and as
aspect
this air
is
is
when
cut
the
off,
folds
it's
going
going
out,
out, separated
pushed by
by
positive,
you get negative pressure there, and it communicates it to the
positive pressure.
glottis,
Then when they
making
come
this
back, it's
more
negative
negative.
pressure. But what happens right out here? It goes from positive to negative, so out here it's
Now,
almost like
really
zero
important aspect of this
air pressure
is when the vocal folds going out,
starting
being
to
pushed
come
by
back.
positive
It's recoil
force,
of that tissue.
vocal
folds
positive
go
air
out,
pressure.
it's like a massive
Then when they
spring.
come back, it's negative air
And
pressure.
so
But what
this
happens
is what
right out here? It
pushes
goes from positive to negative, so out here, it's almost like zero air pressure between. So why do they start to come back? It's recoil of that tissue.
No,
The
no,
vocal folds move out, it's like a mass on a spring.
Oh, thanks.
And
So
so
we have,
this is what
then
pushes,
the
begins to push
folds continue to
folds toward each other,
and
that recoil.
eventually the vocal folds come together, and we have opening, closing, and closing.
Yeah, oh, thanks. So we have
assessment of
then
adduction,
the
vocal
folds continue to come
that is
together, and
abduction.
eventually the vocal folds
This is vibration
together.
isolation.
And we have opening, closing,
Leave adduction
and
to the
close time.
I'd like to show you now
This aspect of
in,
adduction, when the vocal folds are
original
going back and
modeling,
forth,
there's a
that is
great
not
deal of information that is learned that you can't get from
This is vibration and oscillation of vocal
And
folds.
so we
toward each
have
other.
the tissue characteristics of both sides, both vocal folds the same. You're going
I'd like to show you now that in
in motion that is
laryngeal modeling,
each
there's a
other.
great deal of
And
information that is learned that you can't get from studying humans.
displacements
And so if you have the tissue characteristics of both sides, both vocal folds the same, you're going to get phonatory motion that is mirror images of each other.
You can actually
And in
very easily
modeling, you can get displacements
motion,
and angles and
these
flow.
two are showing.
But a little bit
see that
of
difference
difference between the two sides.
This does not
Either
necessarily
an
mean
angle
that
or
the
mass or
is
stiffness.
abnormal.
You can actually very easily get asymmetric motion
the sound is
like
could be actually
these two
like
are
the
showing.
same.
You see that?
And so
we see that a
you
great
see
deal in
abnormal,
high-speed video.
asymmetric
This
motion.
does not necessarily mean that the voice is abnormal in
You may
quality.
not get
The
voice quality.
glottal flow for the
What
sound
does
is could
glottal
be
flow
actually
really
quite
look
the
like?
same.
You're going to take
And so when you see abnormal asymmetric
asymmetric
motion,
motion,
you might not get,
and this is so cool. I mean,
you
this
may
is-
not get
So here
voice
is the
quality
flow,
that
is
says
airflow is seated.
What does glottal flow
That's
really look like?
This
We're
is
going
what
to take
glottal flow
one
looks
of
like.
Dr.
Air
Postman's
particles
lyrics here. He's going
are
to see
at
the
a certain
flow.
speed at any
and this
particular
is so
time,
cool.
everywhere across here.
This is so
You
cool.
add those up. and you
So
get the
here
volume
is
flow
the
at that
flow, is
moment.
airflow is
Time.
seated, and
so
it's
this is-
backlit, and this is what the glottal
And,
flow looks like.
Then you have
Air
things like
particles
this modeling,
are
which
at a
is
certain speed at any particular
Yeah,
time,
more of this
everywhere
we
across
see,
here. You add those
pressures.
up, and you get the volume flow at that moment in
and so on.
time.
So now
And
we're
so
going
this
to
is
do
what
this.
it
Even
looks
this is
like.
a-
And then
Okay,
you
what does a
have
cough look
things
like?
like
So you
this,
got a
frog in your throat is quite
And we want
complicated.
to do a high
And
speed
we need
frequency
more of this, we
as
see
I
pressures.
Good. This is compressed and
Etc.
then this
So
person
now
will
we leave
cough,
with this.
and it's going to wiggle. You'll never cough again, by the way.
Okay, what does a cough look like? So you've got a frog in your throat, and you want to do a high speed frequency of. This is compressed, and then this person
So
goes
look at
off,
all the,
and it's going to wiggle.
wiggling
Yeah,
is so much internal strength.
So you have a frog in your
And
throat.
now you know why there are
So look at all the wiggling.
All right, so
There's
because
so
of
much
these
internal strain.
And
And now you know why there are cough across the country. Right? Just think of the irritation in the tissue. All right, so I think that's... All right, so we covered these topics and everything. Thanks.
The phonation, as we've seen here. Now, as we all know, it's not very easy to actually go inside somebody. You can if you're a doctor, but if you're a mere engineer like myself, I'm not allowed to go inside the body. So I have to make do with whatever I can pick up on the outside. And of course, one of the major things there is the sound that is coming out. And of course, that's actually quite relevant because when we listen to somebody speaking or singing, it's the sound that carries that information. So let's think a little bit about these things. We've talked about the breathing, we've talked about the phonation. Now let's talk about what comes after. Do we really need a vocal tract? Well, we heard that if we were to sever my throat just above the vocal folds and ask me to say ah, it won't sound like ah, it will sound more like something like this. Now, that's phonation. And of course, with phonation only, communication is still possible. For example, we could do sort of Morse code and listen to the works of Shakespeare, but it would be much slower. So it's actually more efficient to have a vocal tract and do things like that modulates the sound, as we shall see. So, and we also heard that speech and song are low in priority for survival. We first need this part. Engineering-wise, it seems very stupid to put everything through the same area. It's very vulnerable. So we've got the blood flow to the brain, we've got the breathing, we've got the swallowing, and those are the priorities. We have to breathe, we have to eat and swallow, and speech and song sort of come fairly low in priority. If you are hurt, if you have to scream out in pain, that will immediately override anything you were trying to say when you needed to scream, for example. So we must not get too haughty about all this and think that speech and song are the most important things in life, because they're not. Anyway, they're important enough. So humans have acquired superb control over the shape of their vocal tract because we have so much to talk about. Dogs don't, because they don't have that much to talk about. Or at least that's how a biologist explained it to me. Which is quite interesting. I mean, you know, dogs can get along with a smaller repertoire of meanings. So let's look at some sounds. Since I'm an engineer, I want to see what comes out. To do that, we're going to first make a little deviation. Let's see now. This is dancing on a thin line, I'll tell you. And are we getting anything? I'm running something and it's taking time. Come on. That shouldn't take that long. So don't worry about what I'm doing here. This is just engineering nerdy stuff. Let's go. There we go. Brilliant. And now, if I switch to that, out of that when I do that. Can you hear me now? Still? Ish? Through the... Yeah, we go. So what do we have here? Well, we have what old engineers used to call an oscilloscope. So on the horizontal axis we have the time, and on the vertical axis we have the amplitude, which is basically how the membrane of the microphone is moving. Or, if you like, the membrane of your eardrum. So we can sort of look at the signal. And we can see that it is a bit grainy for the moment. Let's see if I dare do this, because we were adjusting things all along. This is, come on. I'm going to pull that down. I'm going to set the screen resolution to something else. Come on. This is always nervous. Go back, here we go. Because the computer was powered down. No, it's all right. Okay. So there we are. Now, this is very quick. You can see that if I do, we get a number of cycles across that time frame, which is only a few milliseconds. If I increase the pitch, we get more cycles per second. And if I go down, we get fewer cycles per second. Right. If I were to whistle, you see a rather characteristic waveform. Does it look familiar? Anybody recognize that? A sine wave, right. What's special about a sine wave? Well, it's the sort of simplest variation we can imagine. It has only one frequency, and it's actually the projection of a circle. It's a perfect spiral. And so it's almost uninteresting in itself, because we can't do very much with the sine wave. Well, we can... So it's not entirely useless, but close. Okay, so let's have a little bit closer look now. What am I showing you to the right here? That's the spectrum of the sound. So now we have frequency on the horizontal axis and level on the vertical axis. And the sine wave looks like this. So you see that there's essentially just one frequency moving around. There's a little trace of some other stuff, but never mind. And this is a tool we use a lot for moving into the frequency domain, going to do spectrum analysis, and you'll see a lot of that in the days to come. And the nice thing is that this thing can separate many frequencies into their components. So if we look at this, now I encourage you all to whistle arbitrarily and see if you can see your own whistle in that. What fun. Yes, thank you. 2-1. Okay, so now a very important thing that we need to remember is, how do we measure stuff? On the left side here, we have what's called a linear scale. So what the amplitude of this signal is exactly proportional to the sound pressure variation, the pressure variations in the air. But on this side, we have a level scale. So for each of these divisions here, we have 10 decibels of level. Now, let's be engineering and think about what that means. It means every increase of 10 decibels means that the acoustic power is tenfold. So, which is very weird, really, because if we look at this and I go, it doesn't sound 10 times louder when I move that by one division, does it? And this is a key thing in all of perception, as we will hear in the following presentation, that our senses are sort of logarithmic. We hear ratios, not differences. And that's why we love to use decibels, because that's a ratio. If you say something is 10 decibels stronger than something else, that's like saying a percentage. So we need a reference. We don't have time to talk about the references today, but never mind. Okay, so what do we do when I say, for example, we've now seen that we can see many sine waves at a time. So if I do ah, for instance, now we get a lot of blips here. And each one of those corresponds to a sine wave. So that's kind of weird. Oh, what we see here is actually a sum, or can be thought of as a sum. And that model is very good because we can actually do all the maths and make these curves dance like this. So, or on a very close ooh, you almost get a sine wave. Now, that's the fundamental. What you see there, but you can see that there's a weak second harmonic and a not so weak third harmonic. And if I change my vocal tract, and then if I increase the amount of adduction, going on in this envelope, or the mountain range shifts, right? So we can see some of the harmonics are very strong and others are very weak. And that's because my vocal tract has several resonances. That's one of them. We'll get back to that presently. Now, if I stay on the same vowel, but change the pitch. Let's do Now, do you notice those sort of peaks in the envelope? They stay pretty much put as long as I stay on the same vowel. And that's actually how a vowel is sort of defined. When the brain detects maxima in certain frequency ranges, we call that a particular vowel. And these maxima are caused by resonances in the tract, in the vocal tract. So let's have a look at that more closely as well. We can say, go back to here. And good night to you for the moment, and back to this. Here we go, we've been through that. Okay, so we've talked about the sine wave, and we've actually talked about spectrum, and we'll soon get back to that. But I would like to show you a funny little experiment before, well, we can do a little bit of rehearsal. The sine wave is the simplest periodic waveform. It's a perfect spiral seen sideways. Now, let's see. I'm going to skip ahead because time is of the essence. So let's move on to this one, for example. Now, many years, 200 years ago, a very clever Frenchman called Jean-Baptiste Fourier, he discovered that if you have any waveform, no matter how complicated it is, as long as it's periodic, you can express it as a sum of sine waves. And not just any sine waves, but sine waves whose frequencies are integer multiples of the fundamental frequency. For example, 110, 220, 330, 440 hertz, etc. And that's called a harmonic series. And we can philosophize about how that works, but we're not going to because it takes too long. Instead, we're going to go to the concept of resonance. I talked about there being resonances in the vocal tract. So how do we know if an object has a resonance? Okay, this is fairly straightforward. You hit it. Bonk. Or maybe, and you listen, and if it says bong or ping, yes, there is a resonance. If it says thud or pop, well, a little bit maybe. And if it says or click, then there's no resonance, okay? Now we can say this in scientific jargon, but this is the same thing really. Impart an impulse of energy to a system, record the system's response to this impulse, and each sinusoidal component of this response, if any, corresponds to a resonance. So if I give an impulse to the system, there is a pitch, right? And if I change the resonance frequency, and so on. So we can actually hear a pitch, which has to do with the way that every time I hit the column of air here, it goes and bounces back and forth. And that's sort of the action of the resonance. So now what gets really interesting here is when we inject not just one pulse, but a whole series of pulses into that system. So if I, instead of just going, I do, for example, then, and if I increase the frequency of those, then suddenly something else happens. We get a pitch, and we get a timbre from that. So a single pulse is the one-time event, not periodic, but when we repeat it, it becomes a periodic waveform. And the fundamental frequency is the number of repetitions per second. If the pulses do not repeat exactly, then FO becomes difficult to define. And of course, the human being what it is, they never do repeat exactly. If we have a perfectly stable tone, then it doesn't sound alive. It doesn't sound like it sounds like a machine. Okay. So we've seen this schematic here, sound out, filter through a filter. So the sound at the bottom here would be, or if you like, a little duck call. And then we send that sound through a filter, which has a number of resonances. And so now that sounds like some kind of a vowel, doesn't it? And it's not very expressive because we can't do very much with this, but there are people who do go around saying, so it's the first approximation. Okay. And then, of course, if we add the possibility of articulating, for example, by introducing a constriction into this tube, as you can see now, great fun. Okay. So, as engineers, we love to simplify things. This is a beautiful cylinder, you can put numbers on it. It doesn't look like that at all in your vocal tract. It actually looks more like this, like sort of a cobra ready to strike, because you've got the space between the tongue and the hard palate, and then it narrows down and does all sorts of awkward things. But the sound out then becomes stronger at some frequencies than others. So this is what I was hoping, if time allows. Yes, let's try to do it. Okay, so here I have a pair of headphones that I have massacred in order to be able to seal the pipe to them. And then I will run a sweep recorder. Now I will place my microphone close to the headphone to get sort of a baseline registration of what the headphone's like. If this works, I don't know. For example, I need to tweak up the volume a little bit. That goes there. In the interest of time, I'm sorry, we'll have to skip that. But what we would see would be a frequency response without the tube, and then another one with the tube with big peaks in it, right? So let's try to summarize what we've been talking about. Those peaks are very important. They're so important that they've been given a special name.
Can you use your
Microphone.
Thank you. So these peaks are given a special name. They're called formants because they kind of give a form to the spectra. And the important thing to realize is that the frequencies of these formants are quite independent of the pitch of where I'm singing, at least or talking in the first approximation. I can say an E, and it still sounds like an E, as long as I keep the shape constant. Or I can do or ooh. That's great. So, and in fact, the combinations of these frequencies, first and second formants, give us the vowel space. So we have the cardinal vowels oo, e, a, we've got different combinations, and they exist in all languages. Then the difference between languages, or one of them, is that this space is cut up in different ways. So a map of the English vowels looks quite different from a map of the Swedish vowels. In English, you can get along pretty well with just two formants. In Swedish, we have lots of exotic vowels like I, E, U, E, which are done with lip rounding. So a formant is an acoustic resonance in the vocal tract, and what controls them? It's the shape. And the main articulators are jaw opening, like that, which mostly affects F1, but also the others. Tongue position, and lip rounding, that's great. So we can see, using these formats, we can hear what is being said. But there are more resonances as we go up. And they are more related to the length of the vocal tract. So if I push up my larynx very high, I sound like a shorter person. and if I try keeping the same pitch all the time, but lowering my larynx, I sound like a taller person. And just like our faces are all different, we are also subtly different on the inside of our vocal tracts. And this leaves imprints on the sound. So we are actually very, very good at recognizing people's voices, which is quite fascinating, I think. Now, of what use are the formants? So vowel identity, that's what we just said, speaker identity, and Dr. Sataloff was talking about the singers formant cluster. So singers, in the days where there were no microphones, they had to make themselves heard over orchestras and developed different techniques for that. So an opera singer, if it's a male, will tend to cluster the third, fourth, and fifth formants into one super formant, which is called the singer's formant. Whereas females can't do that really, not as much because their pitches are much higher. Instead, they can put the first resonance on top of the fundamental frequency and get a huge boost in decibels and presumably in salary. So we've looked at sound signals in the time and frequency domains, we've looked at the spectrum of a sound, we've looked at the harmonic series of partial tones, and we've said that formant is a special name for resonances in the vocal tract, and they have special roles for singers, but also for theatrical speakers, and simply for everyone, because we have to have formants in order to say different vowels and consonants. I was hoping to demonstrate some voice synthesis as well, but time ran out. And I think I'll just leave it at that. So, thank you.
Wonderful. Well, now we're going to switch gears just a little bit to perception. So we've talked about production of voice. We've talked about what is produced, the acoustic signal. And now we're going to go back inside and figure out how we perceive sound and voice in particular. So, disclosures. What is perception? So, perception is the process of attaining awareness or understanding of sensory information. And of course, if we're talking about an acoustic signal and voice, we're primarily thinking about the sensory system, the auditory system. There are 5 sensory systems: taste, smell, touch, vision, and hearing. I suppose when we sing or talk, all 5 senses could be involved, but mainly the auditory system. And so when we think about perception of sound, we're going to think about the physical attributes of the acoustic signal, how those physical attributes get transformed at multiple stages within the auditory system, and then how that leads to the perception that we develop in the brain. And so we'll start with the human ear, and normally we divide the human ear into 3 main sections: the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. And this, of course, is reviewed for almost everyone in the room. And we can talk a little bit about the different components. So just to spice it up a little bit, I'll talk about the amazing ear, not the ordinary ear. And since it's Wednesday and it's already night, and some of you, I'm sure, go to Wednesday night trivia, we'll just throw some trivia in for fun and hopefully wake people up just a little bit. So I've got a cartoon of that outer ear, middle ear, and inner ear down below. So we'll start with some world records that the ear holds. Those will be our trivia to get going. So first of all, consider the bone that encases the outer ear, the ear canal, the middle ear cavity, and the inner ear cavity. That's the temporal bone, part of the skull, and the mastoid process is the outer portion of that and rear portion of that, and that's the densest bone in the human body. So we have a world record right there. Let's think about the middle ear. The middle ear doesn't want to be shown by the bones around the middle ear. So the middle ear has 3 little bones inside it. What are the medical terms for those 3 bones? Malleus, incus, and stapes. And what are the cartoon terms for them? Hammer, anvil, and stirrup. Very good. You guys know your trivia. What other piece of trivia might you know about those 3 bones?
Smaller.
World record holders, smallest bones in the human body. Very good. All right, and then we have the pinna, perhaps the most boring part of the auditory system. Great if you wear eyeglasses, hearing aids, or jewelry. But the pinna actually does a few other things as well. So this little diagram here has some labels indicating different features, different prominences, different crevices, different cavities. And those turn out to hold some records as well. It turns out that the outer ear can distinguish among humans as well as fingerprints or DNA. So it's tied for number 1. Pretty neat. It's a little hard to get a print of someone's ear, like if you have it would be a little tricky to do that, but if you could take an image of it, it would work just as well. Furthermore, for the engineers in the crowd, and we may not have a lot of engineers in the crowd, the pinna functions as a filter. The crevices and cavities delay sounds from some locations or sources in space relative to others, and that delay and add network functions as a comb filter. It changes the spectrum, like you see on the bottom of this figure, and the peaks and valleys look like the teeth of a comb. So it's called a comb filter. Now, it turns out those are really, really important. That is the primary way we detect the source elevation of a sound. So if you notice in my little cartoon at the upper left, there's a head and there's a little dot that's changing color and location. That's the sound source. If you play a flat broadband noise to the ear from those different locations in the median plane, you will record a series of peaks and valleys like the spectrum that's changing color. And as the sound source changes from below to at ear level to above ear level, there's a big prominent notch in that spectrum that shifts from about 6,000 hertz to about 12,000 hertz, or 1 octave. And that's the template we use to detect changes in elevation. So maybe not so boring after all, quite useful. The ear canal doesn't want to be outshone either. So the ear canal is a canal. And a canal is very much like a tube. And we just learned about tubes. What is the key acoustic characteristic of a tube? Resonance, exactly. So the ear canal has a characteristic resonance. My left ear might be a little different from my right ear, but they don't change over time. And it turns out that that peak amplification provided by the resonance is around 2,000 to 4,000 hertz. And that turns out to be really helpful for understanding speech. If you go to the Speech Intelligibility Index or the Articulation Index, they have band importance functions. And that tells us what frequencies of speech are most important for understanding. And it looks like that most important speech frequencies overlap with where the ear canal amplifies the most. And the system helps even further because that's also where the intensity of speech starts to drop off the most and where we actually need a little amplification in order to get the clarity of speech that we want to have. Middle ear also has some really interesting acoustic and physical features. So middle ear consists of the eardrum and the 3 little bones behind the eardrum terminating at the oval window to the inner ear or cochlea. And those transduce energy from air or a gas into a liquid, the fluid-filled inner ear. And energy doesn't like to go from a gas to a liquid. There's an impedance mismatch that loses energy. And so the middle ear is designed to overcome that impedance mismatch. So it's an impedance matching network, also an amplifier, and it has 3 different physical characteristics that amplify sound. The area ratio of the eardrum to the foot plate of the stapes at the oval window. I call that the thumbtack effect. You put a certain amount of pressure on the big end of the thumbtack, and you get a lot of force at the little end of the thumbtack. Right? So we get 24.7 dB of amplification on average from the eardrum area ratio to the foot plate of the oval foot plate of the stapes. The 3 bones act like a lever, so sort of giving us about 2.3 dB amplification, and then the pattern of vibration of the eardrum itself gives us some amplification. Overall, we get about 33 dB of amplification to overcome about 33 dB of impedance mismatch because of energy trying to get from a gas to a liquid. The inner ear is pretty complicated and very important. First of all, it's very small. This is showing it against a penny with the semicircular canals as part of the balance system. Without the semicircular canals, it's about the size of a pea. Normally, we see the coiled up cochlea, and the word cochlea comes from the same root as the conch shell. To see inside it, we often take a slice, and it's very much like taking a slice of an apple or an orange and looking at the structures inside the fruit. And so that's what we've done in the upper center. And if you look at that on the lower right, you begin to see 3 chambers, 2 in green and 1 in blue. And the 2 in green have fluid called perilymph. When the ossicles vibrate and the foot plate of the stapes goes in and out, it transfers vibration to that green fluid, the perilymph. That in turn vibrates structures in the middle area there called scala media, which is where all the action happens in the inner ear. And so if you look at the little triangle that I've highlighted there, that's the scala media. On the bottom portion of that is called the basilar membrane. So it's a membrane stretched between 2 bony prominences at either side. And that membrane vibrates in response to vibrating fluid in the perilymph, the green fluid there. And it's tuned so that parts of that basilar membrane vibrate for high-frequency sounds, mid-frequency sounds, and low-frequency sounds. And that's how we begin to code frequency by the auditory system. Now that little structure in the triangle is the scala media. At the bottom of it is the basilar membrane. And in a little box there is the organ of Corti. And the organ of Corti has our sensory cells for hearing inside it. And that's blown up in the bottom center there. And you see on the right side a single cell in purple surrounded by supporting cells in pink. And on the right, that single cell in purple is an inner hair cell. And on top of the hair cell, it has little cilia, little hairs on top of it. When those hairs get sheared in one direction, but not the other, that cell body emits neurotransmitters that bathe neurons that cause an action potential and fire all the way up to the brain. And that's how we get vibration in the fluid into neural activity in the brain. Now the 3 little hair cells on the left side of that figure are called outer hair cells. They get messages from the brain. And when we have a normal functioning auditory system and we're hearing low-level sound, we get a little amplification. The brain tells those sounds, those 3 hair cells to dance a little bit. They move, they change their shape, and that increases the tuning and the sensitivity of the vibration of that membrane, the basilar membrane, and it helps us hear better. When we get older, when we lose our hearing due to ototoxicity or noise, those outer hair cells don't function as well, our hearing gets worse. So, in addition, that whole basilar membrane functions like a stringed instrument. So we've talked a lot about analogies to stringed instruments today. And it turns out that this is no different. So near the base of the cochlea, that's the entrance to the cochlea at the foot plate of the stapes and the oval window, the strings in that membrane are short, they're tight, so they have high tension, and they have relatively low mass. So they tend to vibrate at a resonant frequency that's high. As you move towards the right on the figure, the membrane, the basilar membrane tissue, is longer from side to side, it has more mass, and it has less tension. So it vibrates at lower and lower natural frequencies as you go to the right. So it's like a tuned instrument. You can imagine like a grand piano and looking at the strings, and this being the analogy to that. So when we want to code high frequency sounds, we are exciting the basal part of the basilar membrane, and when we hear low frequency sounds, we're exciting the apical part of the basilar membrane. We also have the central auditory system, and so sounds go, actually, let me go back for a second. There are neurofibers that innervate each part of the basilar membrane and then form a bundle called the auditory nerve, and that goes to the brainstem. And those action potentials that are caused by the hair cells getting bent go through the auditory nerve and stimulate a whole series of action potentials throughout the auditory system. The auditory system itself, the auditory brain, is quite complicated, so I'm just going to highlight a couple of the major portions. The brainstem has three sort of way stations or nuclei that are very important. The cochlear nucleus. It's specialized for beginning to code the important timing, frequency, and intensity cues that we learned about in some of the earlier talks. The next stage codes is the first place where the brain gets signals from both ears, so it can start to compare sounds coming from both ears, giving us binaural cues or sound localization cues. And in the next station, the lateral lemniscus, we start to get parallel pattern processing from both the monaural pathway and the crossing over binaural pathway. Finally, we begin to synthesize those patterns and start the basis of what happens at the next stage, which is generating arousal and attention to sound. And what happens in the cortex is we begin to attach meaning to those patterns. We call it object formation, which helps us identify the source of the sound that we've heard. If there are multiple sources, we can start to discriminate the patterns of those sources and separate them if we want to. And auditory scene analysis allows us to do that on a very large scale, so we can develop an entire scene of the acoustic environment and begin to parse that and focus on different parts and ignore other parts. So that's the central auditory pathway. It's at that latter stage in the auditory cortex where we really form perception of sound, including voice. This is just a simple demonstration of recording from the auditory brain in response to a music piece. And this music piece was filtered already at the input to the ear for the purposes of the study, so it will sound a little unnatural. But then the subject in this study was wearing an EEG cap, so had electrodes all around the outer part of the skull, and those electrodes picked up electrical activity in response to hearing sound, mixed in with all of the other electrical activity that the brain generates in its normal everyday function. What the scientists did in this demonstration is really neat. They recorded that electrical activity, they sent the subject home, they analyzed the electrical activity, and they decided just to take the electrical activity ensemble, treat it as a sound file, and play it out of a sound card. And what you can actually hear is a representation of what was put in coming out of the electrical activity from the electrodes. So if in the back, if the AV engineer can play the left audio file. Or can I don't have a mouse, so I don't think I can.
Is the left audio file?
Left audio file?
Yeah.
All it all was just a break in the wall.
Slightly distorted. It was filtered for this particular study.
All in all it was.
Okay, now play the right one, and this is the brain's electrical activity. Now, literally, this subject was paying attention to something. They were breathing They have muscle movement during all of this. What we are hearing is mixed in with all of that. But you can still hear the remnants of the input to the auditory system. And this was, years after this data was recorded, right? Really amazing. Oh, I guess I did have control. Sorry. So there's some fundamental perceptual abilities related to all this coding of sound. And I'm not going to go into the details, but just to point out that they're all world record holders in the domain of sensory systems. So we have intensity processing. Our intensity coding is exquisite in its precision. We can detect changes less than 1 dB and hear them as loudness changes. At least a trained observer can. We have a range of sound levels that we can hear that's over 110 decibels, and in some cases much larger than that. Much wider than any dynamic range, much higher precision than any other sensory system. Our temporal precision is also very, very high on the low millisecond range, which is faster than any other sensory system. Our spectral precision, the ability to detect a change in frequency, is better than the spectral precision of any other sensory system. And our spatial processing is incredible. So if I want to know where this sound is coming from, one cue is that it arrives at this ear sooner than it arrives at this ear. I can also tell that this is to the right of my head and not in the middle. That delay is only about 10 microsecond difference between the two ears. 10 microseconds, 10 1/millionths of a second. That's how precise our auditory system is. And we use all of that to encode aspects of sound and voice and build these scenes around us that we call auditory scene analysis. So these fundamental abilities lead to some perceptual attributes. And the ones that are most commonly referred to are loudness, pitch, and sound quality. And of sound quality, 3 that are key elements, and the most prominent elements are tonality, roughness, and sharpness. We have a lot of different descriptors of sound quality. They're usually some type of valence marker, like pleasantness, fullness, brightness, harshness, and just literally hundreds of other descriptors of perceptual attributes. And these apply to speech, to song, to lots of other aspects of sound. If you're an automotive engineer, then you think about the sound quality of doors slamming. So those sorts of things are all relevant. In terms of loudness, that's one thing that we talk about a lot, both in speech science, in voice science, in singing. And so this is a classic curve developed in 1933 called the Fletcher-Monson curves. It's a graph of sound pressure level on the vertical axis as a function of sound frequency on the horizontal axis from about 20 to 20,000 hertz. That's the full range of human hearing by air conduction, let's say. And I just highlighted 2 frequencies, 100 hertz, which is very low frequency, and 1,000 hertz, which is sort of a mid-frequency. And we're going to just take a look at some elements of these equal loudness contours because they tell us a lot about how we code sound. First, the very bottom curve there. That's the threshold of audibility as a function of frequency. That's the lowest sound level in dBSPL on the y-axis that an average young normal hearing person can hear as a function of frequency. And you see, we hear best in those mid-frequencies around 3,000 or 4,000 hertz. That's where we get amplification from the ear canal tube. So that makes sense. Our perception is not very good at low frequencies, so we need a lot higher sound level to get to detection threshold as you go to the left of the graph at low frequencies. And one way to think about equal loudness contours is every one of those curves in this function represents equal loudness across frequency. So we'll start with the second curve. At 1,000 hertz, that sound level is only 10 dB sound pressure level. And it evokes a loudness. It's not very loud, so it's a very soft sound. At 1,000 hertz, at 100 hertz, to produce a sound that is equally as soft, we need 46 dB SPL. So you need much higher sound level to produce equal loudness at low frequencies relative to high frequencies. And that is very important for audio playback. If we want to play sounds back at low levels, especially if those sounds were recorded at higher level, then we may need to give some bass boost because the auditory system is really working as a filter at low frequencies. It's not representing the low frequencies at all, or well. But if we go up to higher levels, say 80 decibels at 1,000 hertz, the equal loudness contour is almost flat. And when you go out to 100 hertz, you only need 82 dB to represent the same loudness as you had at 1,000 hertz. So the contour has flattened out. Low frequencies have steeper loudness growth with sound level than mid frequencies or high frequencies. And so at those higher presentation levels, we don't need that bass boost anymore. And if you had it, it would sound too boomy. So audio engineers need to understand those basic properties of loudness perception in order to deal with playback properly. The very top curve is listed as the sort of the upper limit of audibility, and above that you risk danger damaging the auditory system or causing discomfort or pain. Now, when we talk about loudness, it's very helpful to have a systematic way to measure the loudness of a sound and then to refer to it and compare it to other sounds. So about 100 years ago, a scientist named S.S. Stevens came up with a standard measure of loudness. And he assigned to it a standard unit, and the unit of loudness is called a sone, S-O-N-E. And one sone is the standard unit, and it corresponds to a physical value of a 1,000 hertz tone at 40 dB SPL. And because he defined one zone with a physical reference, we can now compare other sounds in the world that we care about to that 1,000 hertz tone at 40 dB SPL and characterize their loudness in units of zones. And so, for example, I went to the Home Depot website a few years ago and I pulled up this data. This is a comparison of 3 different bathroom bands. You can see on the left it costs the most, and on the right it costs the least. And if you look at the bottom row, that's the sound level produced by the bathroom band in zones read from the specs of that bathroom band. If you go to the Home Depot, aisle 27, section B9, whatever, you can pull it up and it'll be on the package. And you can see, in this case, price makes sense. The more expensive one has a sound level that's 0.7 zones. That means its loudness is less than a 1,000 hertz tone at 40 dB SPL. And the least expensive has 2.5 times greater loudness than a 1,000 hertz tone at 40 dB SPL. And if you're buying, I'm remodeling my house, so I'm buying all the appliances. I'm actually going and paying attention to these specs. I want a quiet dishwasher, I want a quiet air conditioner, refrigerator. These are all relevant things to pay attention to. Importantly for this crowd, this standard use of the zone scale to capture aspects of a perception gives us a big hint as to what might be helpful in quantifying voice, particularly in the clinic. So if we're talking about voice quality, wouldn't it be terrific if we had standard scales that related back to physical units? And you could measure voice qualities like breathy, rough, or strain in a way that relates back to physical units. If you did that, then you could now have mathematical models of those qualities. You can relate those qualities, those perceptual qualities, to acoustics in a more accurate way. You can have more accurate measurements. For example, you could mathematically do a subtraction or a division to compare pre-treatment to post-treatment voice quality. And it would be a legitimate comparison with some accuracy that you could measure. And so that is one way of moving the field of voice evaluation forward, is to try to move towards quantifying perception of voice quality in terms of these physical units. So I talked about loudness. Let's talk about pitch for just a second. There are 3 characteristics of pitch. Everybody is familiar with pitch height, low pitch versus high pitch. Most everybody in this room would be familiar with pitch chroma, the notes of a musical scale, and it's represented by the helix in this graph. Pitch strength is something that we don't talk a lot about, but turns out to be very important, and it's the salience of pitch. And so I have an example here And if I use my clicker to play it, I'll play all 3 examples, but I just want to play the bottom one. So if you could just play the bottom one. Low pitch, high pitch. Low pitch, high pitch, weaker pitch strength. Can you play one more time? The second pair has weaker pitch strength. But the same pitch height. And so one way we can quantify things like breathy voice or tonality in other sounds is by considering the strength of the harmonics relative to all of the other components of the sound, which you can almost think of as noise, and that relative strength is mapping onto pitch strength, which is a useful tool. Pitch coding is pretty interesting. There are 2 main ways we code pitch by the auditory system. One is the place of stimulation on the basilar membrane, and that makes a lot of sense. We saw that high frequencies were towards the basal end, the left side of our unfoiled cochlea, unraveled cochlea, and the low frequencies were towards the right side of that cochlea. So place of stimulation maps to the neurons that connect to those hair cells and is one way to code pitch. A second way is a temporal code, and really that was demonstrated by a famous scientist named J.C.R. Licklider about 70 years ago. And he called it the case of the missing fundamental. So in that case, look at these 3 different harmonic complexes. The one on the top includes 400 hertz and the next harmonics above 400 hertz. It would be matched to a pure tone of 400 hertz, and we would say it has a pitch that corresponds to 400 hertz. The second one has 800 hertz, 1600 hertz, and 2400 hertz, harmonics of 800 hertz. It has a pitch of 800 hertz. The third one, most people at the time of Licklider's day would have said that has a pitch of 800 hertz because that's the lowest frequency in the harmonic complex. But he demonstrated that it has a pitch of 400 hertz. And it has a pitch of 400 hertz because those harmonics interact with each other and create a temporal pattern that the brain codes. And the brain uses the temporal pattern, in this case, more than the spectral pattern in order to determine the pitch. Now, we had trivia night. Licklider also invented the internet. I'm not kidding. He's a psychoacoustician, hearing scientist, hired by the government, started ARPA and then DARPA, and wrote first about the internet, about mouses, about graphical user interfaces, and then that paid for it with his government funds to have it all developed. So, trivia. We also have pitch of aperiodic sounds, and so if you think of type 1, type 2, type 3 voices, type 1 tend to be very periodic by definition, type 2 and type 3 less periodic, but they still have a distinguished pitch. So pitch is still carried by the spectrum of those sounds. And finally, I'll leave us with this notion of sound quality in general, unrelated to voice or speech, being made of 3 primary elements. Tonality, the difference between being very harmonically rich versus less harmonically rich, roughness, fluctuations in amplitude and frequency, and sharpness, a spectral pattern that's very distinct. And one way to think of our 3 primary voice qualities is that they are basically the same as 3 primary sound qualities. Breathiness being on a scale of tonality, roughness remarkably being on a scale of roughness, and strain being related to the spectral characteristics of the strained voice signal. And so with that, that gives us sort of a framework of understanding perception, how those acoustic signals that we learned about earlier are coded by the auditory system, its exquisite precision, and then how we build perceptions on top of that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ed.
Hello. If anybody needs to stand up and stretch, take a sec, please. I get very nervous, so it'll make me less nervous if you stand up and wiggle around. Thank you, wigglers. Great, so, what an honor to be asked to do this talk. So really, really grateful to the Voice Foundation Committee for asking me. I think they asked a bunch of people first, but they said, who else do we got? Who else did? Anyway, is this, I'm not used to the clicker here. Is this,
Big green button. Answer slide.
oh, thank you. Now, you're gonna hear later that I'm colorblind. So what he just said made no sense to me. True story. Great, and then I see this has an effect. Is that, oh, wow. Okay, great. So, I am a professor at Indiana University, and I teach voice lessons, and then also, and a couple of my students are right there. And I also teach voice pedagogy, and I started a vocology program there in conjunction with Dr. Rita Patel in speech and hearing at that lovely place. So, I'm pressing the green.
There you are.
Hey, all right. So, I was charged with voice performance pedagogy. Okay, there are a lot of words in there, so I figured we need to know what does it involve, right? It involves a lot of different things, so we're going to discuss some of those things today. This could probably go on for days and years in discussion, so again, I'm probably going to miss some things. So, definition of pedagogy. Let's go to the dictionary. What do we have? We have the art, science, or profession of teaching. And darn it, that word science made it in there. So we actually have to pay attention to that part of it. So then therefore, what would the definition of voice performance pedagogy be? Well, same definition. The art, science, or profession of teaching voice performance. There it is. So, digging in, art. I came up with this just the other day. What is the art of singing? What are we doing? So again, ignore it if you don't like it, but I said the nuanced and intentional use of the singing voice to communicate an idea, feeling, emotion, or concept, often conveying aspects of the human condition or what it means to be alive. So there's the art side of it. And that's really important. Again, that's what we all gravitate towards. We like to feel grounded by the singing that we hear and the stories that are being told through singing. It's a beautiful thing. But then we have to bring the science into it because science provides us with the theoretical underpinnings to guide us in our approach to singing. So it's a daunting task to unite science with practice because it seems like, I thought the same thing, it seems like the antithesis of the artistic experience, which is very emotional and moving. So science doesn't seem to fit in at first. But it does, quite beautifully. And you have to commune with a lot of people in our area in order to figure this out. So, it requires further study, dang it, in anatomy, physiology, and acoustics of the voice. And it also, it would be beneficial to have continued study in learning theory, motor control, motor learning, and mental emotional aspects of voice use. That's a lot to tackle. But we're up for it, right? Go team. So the teaching of singing, I was thinking about it and I thought, well, what aspects should a teacher have in order to excel in this area, right? And I'm sure you guys have a long list of words. I'll give you some of mine. So first and foremost, they need to have a deep knowledge of and passion for the topic. Can't just be phoning it in. I love to teach. I love to sing. And I really, really love to teach other people how to sing. It's like it's in me. Some people love to sing, and then they stop singing, and then they teach. I mean, I wasn't sure what else I was going to do. That can't happen. That's dishonoring the individuals in front of us. So this human being that we see here, that was my mentor, Dr. Barbara Doscher. I miss her every day, and she's with me every day I teach. And so I thought I'd include here, hey Barbs, Babs as I call her, sometimes Snoogie Pooter, if you, sorry, you need to read the the most recent publication of her book, because I actually tell that story in there. We need patience. This is a picture of impatience. So we don't need to have that feeling while we're teaching. We need empathy and compassion. This is a human being we're dealing with. I'll talk more about that in a minute. We need diagnostic skills, and it's best if those are based on physiology and acoustics. That's a really helpful thing, but I do want to say that we should never look down upon intuitive teaching, right? I know some teachers who are intuitive teachers who absolutely line up with what we know from science. And I intentionally said some teachers that that's the case for. I mean, I want to be generous, but I also want to be realistic. It's hard to really hit the nail on the head if you don't know the details of the instrument. It really is. So, discernment. This is a gift we can give our clients. Be discerning. What will last and what will not. Sometimes we think of an array of sounds that someone can make, and we want desperately that they're all okay. But as the teacher, we have to be the one that's helping them assess what will last and what will not last. That's a duty, I think, on our part. A sense of humor. Right? I love this bit. Do you have a sense of humor? Okay, yeah, say nice. Motivational skills. You want to be able to encourage people to dive in deeper. I would say, though, no matter how great someone's motivational skills are, they will never make me do that. Right? There's not a chance. We need flexibility, adaptability, both as the student and the teacher. And when you have those in the learning environment, it produces resilience, and that's really what we're looking for. Kindness, isn't that the cutest, sweetest picture, right? Heart to everybody. We really need to be kinder to each other. There's a long history of negativity in the voice studio and other studios, and I think we need to work as a group to undo that. And then last but not least, mindfulness. I am a practitioner. I am still talking with a reasonably slow tone because I practice mindfulness. I am really nervous. So what do? You focus on your breathing and you calm yourself down in the moment, and then the panic goes away, usually. Great, so there it is. There's a list. Add to the list, please. So, performance pedagogy, what is it really? What are we doing? Well, we're helping our clients navigate the ups and downs of life as a performer. Thank you for liking that. Oh, nerdy. Do not leave me alone with a PowerPoint. So, how are we going to do this? We're going to do this by developing a technique that serves communication in the genre that they're interested in singing in. Right? That's it. We also need to know deeply that technique is the vehicle upon which emotion and intention ride. It is not just to be nerdy. And we have a habit in our industry where people go to coach or they go into a show and they say, leave your technique. And it's like, no, that is your life raft. Right? If you're not far enough along in the process, someone might spot that you're doing something intentionally that maybe detracts from. But ultimately, if you have a really solid technique, that's going to help you be a very nuanced communicator. That's a key thing. And if you want further reading on that, I highly recommend Kenny Werner's book. I'll tell you in the break, but it's called Effortless Mastery. And he talks about this concept. He's one of the best jazz pianists in the world. He will make you laugh, cry, get angry with his playing. I mean, he's so communicative. We also need to help artists pivot through sickness, aging, psychological challenges, emotional struggles. Now, when you hear all those things, yes, indeed, some of those aspects may need to be outsourced to other members of the voice team. All right, so keep that in mind. We also need to help by assisting in translating information that the student receives from coaches, conductors, directors, agents, audio engineers. It is stunning to me over the over 30 years I've been teaching, the things that some people will say to us. It's like as if we're a subclass sometimes. It's very strange. Well, there's the musicians and then singers. And it's like, wait, we can't have that. And so there'll be condescension, downright nastiness, and so we have to, instead of starting a war, we have to be translators. Well, let's dig down, and this is what they said, and this is what they mean. And I mean, that's at the highest level. I'm shocked with some of the stories I have. We need to help the artist to understand their voice. It's not enough for us to understand their voice. They need to be armed with the information about their own voice so that they can become more and more self-sufficient. Now, I wouldn't go as far to say that someone is completely self-sufficient ever, and I use the analogy of tennis. I love tennis. Who is at the tennis match with Roger Federer or anyone else? Their coach, right? They're with them the whole time to just let them know you didn't quite have the wrist in the right position. It's accepted in other areas, and in our area it's like, hey, why did you have a voice lesson before you sang the national anthem? It's like, well, because I wanted to be in the best possible position. So we need to watch out for that. We need to help them by balancing the never-ending quest for higher level of artistry with being okay where they are right now. That's a very important factor. That's hard to do, because you want to be striving, but you also need to feel settled where you are for the next performance. Also, we can help by being part of a voice team. That's of critical importance. We need to be able to talk to laryngologists, speech-language pathologists, voice coaches, other voice builders, and therapists. So if we can be a team, the person that we're working with and serving will feel very, very confident with all these people backing them because they're united. It's a united front. So I enjoy that often, and I gain a lot of insights talking to other people about the client with whom I'm working. So let's get to some of the nuts and bolts of voice building. Voice building is a term used a lot, but it's called Stimmbildung in German. And if you want to know more about that, you can read an article I wrote with my buddy Christian Herbst. I don't know if he's here. See, no, maybe not. That's how much we're friends. Where's the love, Christian? Anyway. But it's in logopedics, phoniatrics, and vocology, and we divvy up different voice roles, so have fun. So first and foremost, what are we doing with the nuts and bolts? We need to practice empathy and compassion. We are dealing with a human being. Their body is the instrument, so they're very attached to it. They're thinking about things that very personally. So if things aren't going well with the voice, things aren't going well with them. So we have to keep that in mind. It's not an instrument where you can say, oh, the humidity ruined the piano. It was the piano. They don't buy that for us. The humidity's really bad in here. They're like, just sing. So anyway, the body's the instrument. Now, we also have feelings, emotions, and sometimes trauma. And maybe you heard earlier, I was too afraid to sit in here. I was pacing, thinking about doing this, and breathing. But people with any strong feelings, emotions, trauma, the signal for our voice goes through the limbic system, and that's our emotional center, and so that can really disturb the signal heading towards our vocal folds, and then we end up with a voice like this, which doesn't go over well when you're singing. I actually just had one of my students suffer that recently. She sang for the memorial service in DC. I don't know if anybody saw that. Maybe not? Okay, she sang the national anthem, no problem. Then she sang in honor of a veteran from Hawaii, and she sang a song, you can look it up, and she just was overwhelmed and had to stop for a moment, live television, and then go. It was pretty intense, but she rallied beautifully. So we have to remember that. When we meet with our clients, we have to listen to their voice history. You're going to gain a lot of insights hearing how they came about, how they came to their singing love. And it will be riddled with things like, they told me to mouth the words in my 3rd grade choir. This lasts, folks I work with at the Met still have that in the back of their head. It doesn't even, logically doesn't make sense. You're like, you're doing your 7th role at the Met. You're still worried about that? And they are. So it really sticks with you. So we have to listen to the vocal history and see if we can gain some insights into how they see their voice in the world. And that's their voice identity. Right? So we're looking at voice identity and what baggage, positive or negative, they're bringing. If it's a healthy awareness of their voice, what it is, we build on their self-awareness and it's best case scenario. If it's a negative, unhealthy relationship with the voice, they still may be attached to it. They still may have attachments to things that are holding them back because they think of that as their voice and it's hard to let go. So we, above all else, the entire time we're working with somebody, we have to be working towards sustainability. Doesn't matter, any of the other things, aesthetics and all, don't matter if it's not sustainable. So we want to emphasize function over aesthetics without ignoring aesthetic expectations of different genres. You don't ignore them, but don't lead with them. Because you will find out that some people may fit better in this area than this area, and I think if you lead with function, you'll uncover that much faster. We want to promote a healthy, sustainable, and effective voice production with the least amount of effort, right? It's the basic idea of don't give too little, don't give too much. We want to find the sweet spot. And keep an open mind. Because if you have an open mind, you're going to help yourself uncover the individual's unique timbre and unique vocal abilities. And so we don't need to insist on our own aesthetic preferences with each individual. Let them evolve and see what their voice has to say in this world. So we want to develop an appreciation for different sound qualities and genres of music if you're going to engage in other music. I've been blessed to be able to work with a very wide range of styles of singing, and I've also engaged myself as a singer in heavy metal and country music and Indian classical singing and opera and all these different things. So it's been a fun thing. Good. Approach to teaching continued. What are we listening and watching for? Well, main thing is balance and ease of production, because that's going to equals to sustainability. The how each system works matters, so checking in with the breathing, the resonance system, phonation, articulation, and also the person's mindset is going to be helpful. And then we have to see how do those things function together. So now this was a lot of black text on a background, so I think that now is the point where we need to add some color to the slides. This is my own joke for my colorblindedness. That's why this is how I see things. And also a discussion of the systems that we just talked about. So to me, the we, the sum and added could be the same color as the and, a discussion of the systems. Isn't that weird how the eyes work? Don't pity me though. All right, so here's some color. That's much better. What color is that? Blue? Lilac. Okay, we have a little bit of division here. Lilac, purple, blue, maybe all those things. All right, so important facts about breathing that we can take into the studio and work with our performers. Well, there is not one way to breathe for singing. So there are, thank you, you're welcome, yes. there are lots of studies now that show tremendous inter and intra-subject variability. So thanks for doing those studies. We want to, in general, a combination of thoracic and diaphragmatic breathing tend to be the most efficient for voice, and not one or the other. And then also we can visualize, we can see the epigastrium expanding, and that's going to let us know that the diaphragm has room to come down. Those are the key components in watching a person engage with singing. Deep breathing can elicit tracheal pull. Right, Dr. Sundberg? Yeah. And it can cause a slight abduction at the vocal fold level, which can help lead to flow phonation. Yeah, great, lovely. You would use this deep breathing with people who tend to press on their voice, have press phonation. Now the opposite is true. Shallow breathing, there's going to be less tracheal pull, and so then the vocal folds will adduct more, and you can use this with the folks that are breathy. You can help them learn what adduction is by using a shallow breath, and then their vocal folds will automatically respond with heightened adduction. Okay. How about the larynx and phonation? Things, takeaways. Higher flow has been found to be advantageous for vocal fold function. Slight abduction can help us avoid excess collision forces, which leads to flow phonation. So there we are, flow phonation again. Friction is the enemy of the vocal fold tissue. There's a finite amount of time that the folds can be grinding together and still be okay. This, in vocal performance, has to be taken into consideration. Many of our students, they sing very well, but they also have to do 4 or 5 interviews before they sing, and then meet the people after the show, and then go into the studio and record something. It's unbelievable, the demands of a singer, so we have to be careful that we're cognizant of how much friction they're going to encounter with their voice load. Getting the appropriate output of sound for any given genre with the least amount of vocal fold friction should be the gold standard of voice training. Okay, so basic idea, practice just enough connection time. That's it. Not more, not less, just enough. Squaring up of the vocal folds lowers phonation threshold pressure, which sounds so sciencey, and increases efficiency of vibration. But how do you get that? Even if that doesn't make a lot of sense to you, the way you get it is by using semi-occluded vocal tract postures. That's where the research has led, and that's why we all go, right? And all kinds of, anyway, those are good to use when you're going to give a talk. Okay, and then that brings us to acoustics. And what are we dealing with there? Well-tuned resonators help facilitate effective and efficient vocal fold vibration. More flow will boost your fundamental, and you get more warmth in the sound when you use more flow. That works great on this mic. So that's a key thing. Now, I did a study with Dr. Sundberg and Dr. Lan and Dr. Lee a while back, and we looked at velopharyngeal opening, an opening into the nasopharynx. And we found that a small velopharyngeal opening is not linked with nasality. That was from an earlier study. But it boosts higher harmonics without loss of the lower harmonics. That's a very tiny velopharyngeal opening. No velopharyngeal opening will increase or boost the lower partials, but decrease the boost in higher partials. And lots of velopharyngeal opening is going to boost higher partials with less boost of lower partials. So we're basically dealing with what I'm talking with right now is a little bit of velopharyngeal opening. No velopharyngeal opening sounds like this. It's completely sealed off and there's nothing going up into the nose. Sounds like you have a cold. And then a lot of velopharyngeal opening sounds like that. Some major access to the nasopharynx. Yeah, very strange sounds. And then finally, mindfulness, the other category that we discussed. So a person's mindset will be affected by the use of mindfulness techniques. How? Well, the mindfulness can significantly better working memory capacity. That's a nice find. And also it can help us to be better able to sustain attention during a performance task. God, I'm hungry. Oh, sorry. What was I doing? It can also help develop the skill of self-observation, which neurologically disengages the automatic pathways that were created before this learning session you're having. And it enables present moment input to be integrated in a new way. So that's a key component, being present. I'm sure we've all here, live in the moment, be present. And that is a key aspect of really high-level learning, faster learning. If someone practices mindfulness, they're able to do this. It also, mindfulness increases information processing speed. That's good, that's nice to have. And it decreases task effort and having thoughts that are unrelated to the task at hand. I think in the very distracted time we live in, with the phone buzzing and ringing, and my favorite are the watches. I have one too, and when this trend first started, my students would be singing, da 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 da, da 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 da. I was like, there's a clock on the wall. Like, are you ready to get out of here? And they say, oh, no, somebody's buzzing me. Somebody's buzzing me. So they would just be taking a look at whether it's an emergency, I guess, or whether it warrants getting out of the voice lesson. Anyway, this is a while back. And so I thought, man, I don't want to rule out watches, but if you do things in the studio to really attract attention, then they stop looking at their watch. So I kind of do my own studies in the studio. If I'm animated and really motivational, then they tend to look at their watch less. If I'm tired, they look at their watch more. So mindfulness will help us focus on what we are doing while we are doing it, and it encourages observation over judgment. So discernment that I mentioned earlier is linked with observation, and observation is a non-judgmental thing. It's a really positive thing to have in the studio. So with all that said, what else do we want to aim for here? Well, clearly, we all know flow phonation, right? Flow phonation would be a key thing. We saw it highlighted twice. How do you define it? It's the highest possible flow with complete glottal closure. Yes, I have an annoying addendum on there, and it's just a shout out to our treble voices who tend to have a little posterior gap, and their voices operate just fine. So I throw that in there. I hope that's not offensive, Johan. He'll let me know later. Effective use of resonance, also known as resonant voice. It was defined as voice that is easy to produce and vibrant in the facial tissue. So what does that mean? It just means that when you're using resonance, a lot of people will feel a little vibration towards the front of the face. All that is sympathetic vibration that's indicative of a good use of the resonatory system. So that's helpful. Now, with proprioception, which is the ability to sense stimuli arising in the body, it's different for everybody. So you might find people that feel a little more dead towards the front of their face. They don't have a lot of signal. So don't blame them for that. It will also vary if people have any kind of cartilage on the soft palate or any deviated septum, that kind of thing. That will vary this buzz feeling. But a lot of people will feel this, oh yeah, more towards the front, great. So I do subscribe to that, but it's not an absolute. We also need to cultivate a present, positive, and proactive mindset, which is the mindfulness part of it. Which you can do in a variety of ways. We don't have enough time to talk about it right now, but awareness of breathing is one of the ways to control the wild horses that are swimming around in our mind or running around in our mind. Horses can swim too, I think. So I think we're all right. Okay, so things I've learned along the way. God, it's already that fast. Okay, sorry. Things I've learned along the way: meet each individual where they are technically, mentally, emotionally. That means not just the first time you met them, but every single time you encounter them. Some people will come back after having a lesson and be 10 steps back from where they were before. So you don't want to expect that they can do the same thing. They also might be miles ahead of where they were before, and you don't want to hold them back because they couldn't do it the last time. So keep that in mind. Keep an ongoing dialogue, that's very important. Ask how it feels. So how it feels is going to help awaken proprioception. That's one of the main things we're training in vocal performance, is proprioceptive awareness of what's happening. Remember, whoops, that one, you guys get the idea. Oh, I figured it out. Their descriptions, not ours, are the most important thing there. You should feel is probably not a good way to go. So ask their impressions of sounds. Sometimes they don't like the sound they're making. And we have to welcome that into the room and help them understand that they can't really hear their voice like other people hear their voice. We need to use contrast and comparison. A good example of this is negative practice. So if someone tends to speak with a little gap like that, going back and forth between that and that is a great way to highlight what's happening when it's not what you want, and then what's happening when it is what you want. A negative practice. Watch for self-correction and name it. My mentor, Barbara Dalsher, used to always say, let them sing. Meaning, sing and things are going to happen. The person's mind-voice connection is going to make adjustments. And when they do, that's golden. Say, look, oh, that was much better. I love that. What did that feel like? And then you've invited in a team approach with your students. Always compare backwards. Could I do this 6 months ago? Genius. Never compare to what you're hoping to be able to do. What could you not do back in the past? Almost there. I'm almost there, I promise. Repetition, repetition, repetition. And if you're a Bernsteinian learning theorist, then repetition with variation. I know anything's fine, but basic idea is repeat, 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 so it becomes habitual. And then when you're in a pressured situation and distracted, that it will still show up because it's a myelinated pathway. Yes. Positive reinforcement during or after the task. Oftentimes we learn in learning theory that you should wait and that you should wait till after something happens, but when you get somebody who's very down on themselves, you need to have the pom-poms out while they're singing, just to get them comfortable, trusting you, and so doing that proactively is really helpful. Success leads to improved learning. What does that mean? That if they feel like they've made a successful move forward, then they will engage more, and we're well studied that engagement will lead to better learning. Learn to identify transitional sounds and name them as correct. That's how you give them the successes. So you might have this lofty goal way down the road, but today we did this and then you were able to do this. Yes, that's correct. Then they feel engaged again. Don't hold the end goal in mind is the concept. Alexander technique and FM Alexander came up with this end gaming. We want to aim for the next step in the process. Last slide on these suggestions. Provide greater specificity with exercises and training tools used in voice training. How an exercise is employed matters. I have been blessed to go around the world teaching. I'm at 17 different countries. Who's counting? I don't care. Anyway, but it's been interesting. Everywhere I go, there are very inefficient lip trills that really are not serving them very well. So the specificity in how you do a lip trill matters, or any other tool. Provide remedies for vocal imbalances before naming them. So give somebody a solution. Once they've done it and had success, then name what they were doing before and what they're doing now. Instead of dropping the gauntlet and saying, you're flat. The gauntlet's dropped and they're scared and they're not going to do anything different. We need to create a healthy sound playground and make things better first. Develop resonance, flow, and overall proprioceptive awareness using light mechanism first, also known as head voice, regardless of the genre you're working in. Light mechanism. So it's really important because there's less resistance at the level of the vocal folds at that point. So if you're going to get flow awareness, that's the best environment to do it in. You do not need to train someone classically to do that. You just need to do light mechanism. That's it. So learning requires mindfulness over time. Last slide. How do you learn all this stuff? Right? How on earth? You get lucky and you have great mentors, right? But reading's a good place to start, but there's a tremendous amount of suspect info out there. So be careful with that. And also, TikTok, YouTube, not the best place to learn. Not a lot of vetted stuff on there, right? So you really need to observe well-established expert teachers and pick their brains. You also need to make friends and hang out with voice scientists. Very easy to meet at a meeting like this. And some of them are quite tall. So, y'all, right? Laryngologists, right? Hang out with them. Easy to meet with the other doctors on the golf course. Anybody? No? Okay. I've just played golf with a laryngologist before. I just thought I'd throw that out there. And then don't forget hanging out with speech-language pathologists. And I promise y'all, they are everywhere. They're in primary school, secondary school, colleges, universities, voice centers, and hospitals, right? They're everywhere. They're even on the flight with me on the way to Philadelphia. One was right next to me. Rita Patel. Where is she? We had a great chat on the way here. So thank you for your attention and go with the flow.